The first Soviet strategic nuclear bomber was the Tu-4A Bull. This miracle of reverse engineering was a close copy of the three B-29 superfortresses that had force landed in the Soviet Far East during 1944. The Bull was a quantum leap forward for Soviet long-range aviation, which had previously operated less capable indigenous types like the Petlyakov PE-8. But the Soviet Union was a very large country, as was the US and as was Canada. So, although the Bull's 3,500-mile range was excellent for the day, it was insufficient for the task of attacking US cities over the pole. Various solutions were tried, including in-flight refueling and the use of drones launched by the Bull. None of these really worked, so the only practical option was for the Bull's crew to deliver their weapons and then bail out over the sea at a predetermined location. Waiting submarines would then return them to what was left of the motherland. The other problem, as the 1940s turned into the 1950s, was that the Bull lacked the performance to survive against jet-powered, rocket-armed US interceptors. More range and more performance were therefore required to maintain the Soviet deterrent. Having got the Tu-4 into production, Andrei Tupolev began to develop more advanced versions. His Project 471 and 485 both replaced the four radial engines with six ASH 473 turboprops and extended the wingspan to 183.5 feet from 143 feet in the Bull. Weight went up from 140,000 pounds at maximum load to 190,000 pounds. Intelligence reports in the West led to these concepts being labelled as the Tu-200 and seen as an equivalent to the B-36 Peacemaker. Tupolev's next design study was the Tu-80, which redesigned the wing, changed the engines and added about 15% more internal fuel by increasing wingspan and thus increasing the size of the wing tanks. Retaining a broadly similar fuselage allowed many of the machine tools used for the Tu-4 to be retained, although the new aircraft was nearly 10 feet longer than the Bull. The engines were 2,700 horsepower radials with fuel injection. In combination with some streamlining, range increased to 5,000 miles. It flew for the first time on the 1st of December 1949, but although it demonstrated superior performance all round, it was deemed to represent insufficient progress, and the aircraft was relegated to flight test work. Undeterred, Tupolev's next attempt was the Tu-85. This had the same stepped cockpit design and high tail as the Tu-80, but added yet more powerful 24-cylinder Dobrynin VD4K engines that produced a mighty 4,300 horsepower each. The Tu-85 was therefore a big upgrade over the Bull. It had a maximum speed of nearly 400 miles an hour, and better still, it had nearly 7,500 miles of range on internal fuel while carrying 11,000 pounds of bombs in its two bomb bays. Maximum load was 40,000 pounds. Such was the Tu-85's performance that production was authorised and factories began to tool up to make it. But just as that decision had been taken, in 1950 US plans to field aircraft such as the F-89 Scorpion filtered through to the Soviets. Although the Scorpion is now considered quite laughable, with a maximum speed in excess of 600 miles an hour and ability to climb to 40,000 feet, it rendered the piston-powered Tu-85 obsolete. The same logic also curtailed the B-36 Peacemaker's career. In response to this problem, Tupolev's rival and former apprentice, V.M. Mashishev, approached the Air Force with a proposal for a giant bomber capable of flying 8,000 miles and hitting nearly 600 miles an hour on its bomb run. The M4 was based on Sagi analysis of German research into swept-wing jet bombers, which also inspired Tupolev's Tu-16 Badger. Tupolev's conclusion was that a 300,000-pound swept-wing aircraft could be made with the range to get to the US and the performance to survive in its skies long enough to deliver its nuclear payload. To make this aircraft, his design team began to study grafting a very long 35-degree wing onto the successful fuselage of the Tu-85. The power plants for the new aircraft remained very much in the air, as it were. The M4 was powered by 4 AM3 turbojets, so that was definitely an option. Tupolev had also experimented with fitting TV-10 turboprops to a Bull, so he knew that option well too. He also toyed with a mix of turboprops and turbojets. Having tried out many combinations, the team realised that the only real option was to go with the 4 TV2 turboprops. These gave only 560 miles an hour of top speed, but their superior fuel economy gave 8,000 miles of range, a figure that had become the minimum for the Air Force at that time. The TV2 engine was an interesting power plant. It was developed by captive German engineers led by Ferdinand Bradner and under the supervision of Nikolai Kuznetsov at OKB 276. For this reason, it was originally based on the Junkers UMO 002. The TV2 ran on the bench at 5,000 shaft horsepower, which wasn't enough for an aircraft in the desired weight class of the new bomber, but uprated versions were approaching readiness. The TV10, that Tupolev liked a lot, would produce 10,000 horsepower, and the TV12 that was to follow it a mighty 12,000 horsepower. Either would do quite nicely. Although Tupolev believed that he had arrived at the right set of performance compromises, the Soviet Air Force generally believed that the faster M4 Bison was the better technical option and should be produced rather than the Tupolev design. Nevertheless, Andrei was summoned to the Kremlin in late 1950 to meet with Stalin and explain his point of view. The meeting was successful. Stalin saw where Tupolev was coming from, and he ordered development of both the M4 and the new Tupolev aircraft to proceed. It was at this point that Andrei's aircraft would acquire its now famous designation. The new bomber was to be referred to as Bomber 95, or Tu-95. Power plant problems immediately surfaced. The TV-10 and 12, redesignated NK-10 and 12 for production, were nowhere near on schedule. To fill a gap, OKB 276 combined two of their smaller TV2 engines by way of a very strong custom-made gearbox to give 12,000 horsepower. The other major problem at this juncture was the propeller that this brute of an engine would drive. Tupolev's calculations suggested that a 23-foot diameter prop would be needed, which was impractical due to the height of the landing gear that would be required, and challenges in making such a monstrous device in the first place. It was this problem that led to the adoption of the Tu-95's distinctive contra-rotating propeller arrangement, consisting of a pair of four-bladed props that turn in opposite directions. Tupolev then went back to see Stalin with a proposal for a bomber powered either by 4 of the dual TV2 engines, designated 2TV2F by this point, or 4 of the originally specified NK-12s. Formal approval was issued on July the 11th, 1951. Stalin wanted one of each aircraft, with the first prototype flying in September 1952. Such was his confidence in Tupolev that in November 1951, Factory 156 at Kubyshev was ordered to begin tooling up for mass production. Work on that started in January 1952 and it was completed in September. Tupolev's prototype plant got started on building a mock-up of the aircraft in August 1951, and Kuznetsov's team began to fly the 2 TV2F motor on a Tu-4, in place of one of its radial engines. Although that clever engine performed well, flight tests and additional calculations showed that it gave about 25% less radius of action than the advanced TV-12 would. On that basis, the 2 TV2F was dropped from consideration as a power plant beyond the first prototype. Mock-up construction happened in parallel to the engine design drawings being made. Concerns about sustaining the deterrent apparently caused corners to be cut in pursuit of an in-service date. Specifications were therefore developed as the team went. The new bomber was designed to carry a bomb load of 30,000 pounds in a single bay. It was laid out internally for a crew of 8, none of which would be seated on ejector seats, as their size and handling requirements would have added weight and complication to the design and ergonomic problems for the crew. Many innovations were, however, incorporated. Tsargi supported Tupolev in redesigning the Tu-95's wing structures so that they would have the strength that the Air Force wanted, but not be too heavy. Specially developed aluminium wire was used for the long runs of cable, saving vital weight over copper on an aircraft that inevitably carried a large number of electronic systems. Lightweight electrical de-icers and starters were developed for the NK-12 engines, and so on. Considerable thought and debate went into the control system. Tsargi favoured a hydraulic system given the weight of the aircraft and its speed. Although there were merits to this, Tupolev considered such systems to be excessively heavy and complicated. He therefore developed a mechanical system that, although relatively heavy for the pilot, was acceptable in use and benefited from much lower maintenance and much higher reliability. His arguments were accepted by Tsargi, and the Tu-95 went forward with an unboosted mechanical control system. It wasn't until the 31st of October that the designs were signed off by the Air Technical Committee. Even then, there would be more arguments and points of debate throughout development of such a complex and strategically important platform. Helpfully for Tupolev, the Soviet Air Force concluded that they'd been wrong about the trade-off between speed and range. They now wanted something with at least 9,300 miles of range, and preferably upwards of 10,000 miles. Long-range maritime patrol and mine-laying now entered the mission set for the first time, alongside general atomic bombing. From being distinctly in second place, Tupolev were now moving into the lead. Now they just needed an aircraft. The mock-up of that was first inspected by the technical staff in December 1951. Factory 156 began to build the flying prototype, completing their work in the autumn of 1952. It was moved to Zhukovsky and reassembled by the middle of September, all under the watchful eyes of the KGB, who were desperate to prevent any leaks. To that end, the KGB removed residents from the vicinity of the airfield prior to testing beginning. Secrecy assured and powered by 4 Tu-TV2Fs, the first Tu-95 began taxi tests in October. On the 12th of November, it was time to take flight for the first time, which it did successfully, climbing to about 3,000 feet and flying for 50 minutes. Flights proceeded with 16 completed successfully before a massive gearbox failure on one of the engines led to the prototype being grounded for 5 months, so that the cause could be diagnosed and fixed. These delays heaped pressure on the design and engineering teams. When the aircraft returned to the air, there was much catching up to do, and increasing amounts of risk as people tired after working around the clock for months. The inevitable disaster struck on May the 11th, 1953. Tupolev himself was present as the aircraft, commanded by A.D. Pereljot, got airborne and began the test. Things went well to start with, and then without warning, Pereljot radioed to say that the number 3 engine was on fire and he was returning to base. A couple of minutes later, he reported that the engine had fallen off, the wing was on fire, and that he had commanded the crew to bail out. Shortly thereafter, the prototype crashed near Nojinsky, 40 or 50 kilometers from Zhukovsky. Tupolev and his team made their way to the town and then rode horses to the crash site, which was still burning. Miraculously, 7 of the crew of 11 had survived. Pereljot was killed. Most unlucky was the navigator, who had escaped the aircraft, but was then killed when his parachute was caught in the blast and heat from the crash. Another crewman from the technical staff had escaped the aircraft, but he hadn't properly attached his parachute and he fell to his death. The accepted wisdom about the crash in the early days was that the number 3 engine mount had failed. This led to it detaching, severing the fuel lines and causing an uncontrollable fire. Charges were therefore levelled at the superintendent of Factory 156 and a colonel at Tsargi who was in charge of the engine mount static testing program. They were to be summarily charged and executed until Marshal Zygarev intervened. After hearing the 2 men's testimony, he cancelled the order to charge them. Sometime later, fragments of the number 3 engine were found. When they were tested, those tests revealed that metallurgical problems similar to that which had caused the previous engine issue had likely caused this accident as well. The gearbox was, after all, subject to immense forces, and it had failed after only 10 hours of running. During the second inquest, technical documents were discovered at Kuznetsov's OKB. They showed that in static testing of two Tu-TV2F engines, the same component had failed after between 40 and 50 hours of running. In both cases, this resulted in an engine fire. By rights, Kuznetsov should have been executed for this failure, but Tupolev lobbied for other penalties. One way or another, Kuznetsov was a great designer, and those were hardly two a penny. He thus survived. Needless to say that testing of the NK-12 engine was much more stringent before the second prototype was cleared to fly. The other area of enhanced testing was in the fire extinguishers fitted to various components of the aircraft. Better safe than sorry. All of this caution caused delays. The second airframe was ready in November 1952, but the NK-12s weren't cleared for flight until December 1953. The delays meant that 15 aircraft built at Kubyshev were left engineless during 1954 and 55 while flight testing was completed. The first flight of the second Tu-95 took place on the 16th of February 1955. It went well, and it was the first of 68 flights at the OKB. In the summer of 55, the aircraft was visited by Khrushchev himself, who sat in the cockpit and discussed the aircraft with its creator. It also took part in the 1955 Tushino Air Show, but without introduction. This was when it was given the Bear code name by NATO, but for 2 years it was understood to be an Ilyushin and referred to as the IL-38. When it was discovered that it was actually made by Tupolev, the incorrect Tu-20 designation was applied to it. That actually wasn't completely erroneous because the Soviets had intended to use that designation for the aircraft in service, but because Bomber 95 had been used in so many documents, they decided to keep it. After Tushino, testing continued, now including long-range flying. These missions initially went up to 8,600 miles, carrying a whopping 168,800 pounds of fuel. In other words, the Tu-95 was lifting more than a Tu-4 in fuel alone. Success during this testing began the process of readying the Tu-95 for operational service. The aircraft that the Soviet Air Force would be getting was remarkable. It was 151 feet long with a 164-foot wingspan. At takeoff, the original Bear could weigh as much as 344,000 pounds. Despite its size, it was mostly conventional in construction. As with most Soviet aircraft of the era, it was built from two aluminium alloys, D16 and D95. D95, I believe, was for the main structures. D16 was used for areas exposed to higher temperatures. The long and slender fuselage is a semi-monocoque with low frontal area. Although you might not immediately think so, the fuselage diameter is roughly the same as that of the B-52 Stratofortress at 2.9 meters. The fuselage is broken into two pressurized sections at the front and the rear. In front sit the commander, deputy commander, navigator, second navigator, senior technician, the gunner, and the ECM operator. As I said, there were no ejection seats, so emergency exit was via panels in the cockpit canopy frame and various other doors around the fuselage. These could be jettisoned using compressed air if required. An inflatable slide was provided for rapid escape to the ground. Two inflatable rescue boats are behind the cockpit on the left side of the fuselage. Access to the crew cabin in normal situations is via a hatch in the nose landing gear bay. A radar is mounted under the nose ahead of the nose wheel bay. The exact type depended on the version of Bear. The dielectric radome got larger over time, starting out as more of a bump on the lower nose. Those early Bears have glazed upper noses with electrically de-iced glass panels. The nose gear has 2.1 meter diameter tyres on aluminium wheels. The wing is attached to the section behind the pressurized forward crew compartment, and it's followed by the heated but unpressurized bomb bay. That large bay can cope with single weapons of as much as 20,000 pounds each, although the normal load as a strategic bomber was 13,000 pounds of total ordnance. That's the weight of a single 1 megaton range Soviet hydrogen bomb. A wide range of strategic and tactical weapons could also be carried in the bay, and its configuration changed over the Bear's service life. When fitted, the Bear's chaff and flare dispensers are also contained in the bay. Fuel occupies most of the aft fuselage, ahead of the pressurized section in which the tailgun station commander and the radio man/gunner are stationed. A pressurized crawl space allows access between the two sections. The wings also contain fuel. Their upper surfaces feature 3 stall fences per side, and there are flaps and ailerons on the trailing surface. The inboard engines are on the first wing section, with the main landing gear positioned behind them in the extended nacelle. Unsurprisingly, this structure is extremely strong. The landing gear itself is quite interesting in that the main gear rotates through 180 degrees as it retracts into its housing. It is electro-hydraulically actuated, and as you'd expect, it's a tough unit consisting of an aluminium truck assembly that carries 4 1.5-meter diameter tyres. All the main gear wheels are fitted with disc brakes. All Bears are powered by versions of the mighty NK-12 turboprop. As I'm about to get to, the first Bears had the original NK-12, which produced 12,000 shaft horsepower. Early in the run, these were switched for the upgraded NK-12M, which gives 15,000 horsepower, and later on the NK-12MV, which gives roughly the same horsepower but has some other quality of life improvements. NK-12 is an axial turbine with 12 compressor stages. Each motor drives counter-rotating 4-bladed propellers at 736 RPM via a reduction gear which steps down from the 8,300 RPM turbine speed. 54.4% of the power goes to the front propeller, and 45.6% goes to the rear. The front propeller spins clockwise, the rear one anti-clockwise. You came here for trivia, and I deliver. Pitch is hydraulically controlled, and the pilot can feather the props manually from the cockpit. An automatic emergency pitch control system was developed early in the Bear's service life due to an accident in November 1956 in which a crew was too slow to feather the propellers of an engine that had failed, leading to a stall and a crash that killed all aboard. Engines with automatic feathering are designated NK-12V, and they were refitted to the fleet by 1960. Because the reduction gearbox on the NK-12 was subject to a great deal of force, appropriate lubrication was essential. The Bear was frequently deployed in places that were very, very cold, so special heating systems were installed on the aircraft in an attempt to pre-warm the oil before engine startup. Because it's a turboprop engine, a titanium jet pipe provides additional thrust from the engine exhaust, in addition to that driving the propellers. Each engine has its own fuel system, although they all draw from a system of 71 tanks. Each engine also has 2 DC and an AC generator fitted to it, providing electrical power for all of the systems and a great deal of redundancy. 12 batteries smooth out the current and provide backup. Given the nature of the loss of the first prototype, fire suppression is well thought through. The engines are firewalled off from the wing structure and redundant extinguishers are contained in the nacelles. Starting on the ground is accomplished using a single TS-12M turbine starter. Completing the aerodynamic package is the tail, which is swept at 40 degrees. Elevator and rudder trailing edges are made of magnesium. Because it was intended to operate thousands of miles from the nearest fighter cover, the Bear had quite a potent defensive armament setup. It has 3 gun positions, each mounting a pair of AM-23 cannons, which fire 23mm shells at about 1,300 rounds a minute. They are remote-controlled, electrically actuated and radar-directed. Optical sighting is also provided. The dorsal turret was retractable and contained 700 rounds. The ventral turret had 800 rounds and the tail turret 1,000. The first pair of production Bears were released to the Air Force for service trials at the end of August 1955, allowing a trials program to begin in October 1955. This carried on until the end of May 1956. The trials showed that the new Bear could fly as far as 9,300 miles, which was less than the Air Force had wanted. It was, however, good enough, so series production was authorized. Other statistics for this early version, powered by the 12,000 horsepower engines, was a maximum speed of 548 miles an hour and a service ceiling of 37,000 feet. Disappointment with the no suffix Tu-95 led to the rapid development of the Tu-95M, which had the uprated NK-12M engines, each giving 15,000 shaft horsepower. That modification increased speed to 568 miles an hour, ceiling to 40,000 feet, and most usefully, range up to 10,400 miles. Operational range with a war load was more like 8,000 miles. The Bear's priority increased markedly when it was discovered that the M4 Bison had only about 5,700 miles of range and was thus a one-way weapon. Mass production of the Tu-95M therefore began in 1957, based on airframes already completed but waiting for engines. Relatively few of these aircraft were built, though. A total of 30 Tu-95 non-suffix aircraft were made, 4 in 1955, 23 in 1956, and 3 in 1957. They were followed by 19 Tu-95Ms, 5 in 57 and 14 in 58. In practice, these two types were functionally identical, and they served together in the same squadrons. Operational deployment began in April 1956 at Uzin in Ukraine. The next division was based at Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan, and by the end of the 1950s there were 2 regiments operating the type. Like their US counterparts, the Bears were essentially on a round-the-clock quick reaction alert armed with nuclear weapons. This proved problematic in the Bear because of the need to keep the engines lubricating oil at the right temperature all the time so that the motors could be safely started. If they were deployed to bases without the right external heating equipment, then the engines had to be warmed up and started every 3 hours or so to heat the oil. This in turn caused issues with engine life and required even more frequent overhauls than the temperamental Mk-12 needed to start with. Cold weather operations were the norm, as in the 1950s the Soviets were in the process of constructing bases in the far north of the country to bring all of the US in range of their bombers. Bear crews were some of the best trained in the Soviet Air Force, and they had to be. The northern runways were only slightly wider than the Bear's wingspan, and they were generally covered in snow to some extent at least. As well as training for takeoff and landing, the crews trained for high altitude and low level attacks on US strategic targets year round. Low altitude in a Bear was below 700 feet, and attacks would either be as single ships or pairs in formation. The sight of a Bear at full throttle on the deck must have been something to behold, not to mention the noise, which was a weapon in of itself. After their mid-life update, bomb aiming in the early Bear was via the Rubin 1D short-horn radar bomb sight in the nose. Release was manual and cued via an optical sight that connected to the radar system. An automatic radio compass and a set of radar altimeters aided navigation to the target. Nuclear-tasked Bears were painted with anti-flash white paint on their undersides, and they had a visor system in the cockpit windows, just like a NATO strategic bomber. These were properly speaking Tu-95As or MAs. NATO called them Bear As. Improving air defences over the US were evident to Soviet planners even before the Bear flew for the first time. Fortunately, the Bear's tall landing gear and good clearance under the fuselage made it a perfect platform for launching the less-than-compact standoff missiles that were then under development. The first of these weapons was the KH-20, which was the responsibility of the MiG-OKB. KH-20 was used because the Tu-95 was supposed to be the Tu-20. The missile carrier version would be the Tu-95K, and it was based on the uprated Tu-95M. Design sketches were completed by the end of October 1956. It differed from the freefall bomber through the fitment of the large YAD, or crown dome, search and attack radar under the nose. It also had a modified bomb bay that featured a beam that could be lowered into the slipstream with the missile attached so that its turbojet could get started. The aft fuel tank was altered so that the KH-20 could be fueled ready for flight. The bomb bay also had a retractable fairing at the leading edge to cover the missile's nose intake and prevent it windmilling in the slipstream. 2 Tu-95s fresh off the production line were modified to test these modifications and the weapon system more broadly. The flight test program was completed in 1958 and series production began in March, replacing the Tu-95M on the line. 47 aircraft were completed between 1958 and 1962, 3 in 1958, 17 in 59, 17 again in 1960, and then 10 in 1961. Service entry began in 1959. Although it doesn't look like the most sophisticated weapon ever made, the KH-20 was quite effective when it was used in training. Hit rate was about 75%, even in an environment with jamming. It could also be used against moving ships at sea, predicting a future role for the platform. As Soviet ICBMs became more accurate, the Bears were increasingly tasked to attack US carrier groups, so the weapon's usefulness as a maritime strike weapon would have been convenient. The Tu-95K was followed by the Tu-95KD, developed as a response to the 2,500-mile range reduction that came with fitting the KH-20 and the K-20 avionics system. Soviet aviation's solution to the problem was to develop a range-extending in-flight refueling setup. There were two options for this: the tip-to-tip system favoured by Tupolev and used on his Tu-16 Badger, or the M4 Bison's conventional probe. The Bear's long, flexible wings made a tip-to-tip setup pretty impractical, so the Conus probe system was adopted instead. To use it, the modified Bear had a probe installed on the nose, just ahead of the cockpit. Its pipework ran down the starboard side of the aircraft and fed the central fuselage tank. Fuel was then pumped into the other tanks from there. Transfer rate from the tanker was £10,000 per minute, and the M4 could transfer about £100,000 in a single operation. 23 additional Tu-95KDs were built, 10 in 1962, 8 in 1963, 4 in 1964, and 1 in 65. Tu-95K and KD aircraft were known to NATO as the Bear B, and they served through to the early 1980s. At the end of the 60s, all of the KDs were upgraded to a new standard called Tu-95KM. This replaced the PRS-1 radar bomb sight with a new PRS-4 unit. A new SPS-3 radar warning receiver was fitted on all aircraft, alongside a ROM-4 passive signal detection kit on some. Navigation systems were totally overhauled with a new SHORAD, radio compass and altimeters. KH-20 was replaced by KH-20M, which gave 230 miles of range, provided that the carrier aircraft maintained line of sight to the missile while it was in flight. The need to maintain contact was a weakness, particularly during a nuclear exchange and all of the attendant interference and jamming. The lack of true standoff capability was well known even after the K entered service. The range penalty for the launcher basically made the missile pointless, though. It also required more than 20 hours to arm a Tu-95 with one because it was so unwieldy. 190 rounds were bought, and eventually the turnaround time was reduced to 4 hours, but the missiles were quickly phased out. In the 1980s, some KMs were further upgraded to launch the KH-22 or AS-4 Kitchen missile. KH-22 was much more capable, and it remains in service today. It weighs about 12,600 pounds, has a range of up to 500 miles, and it can carry a 1 megaton warhead. Serious consideration was given to building a dedicated Tu-95 K-22 or Bear G version of the aging aircraft to carry the missiles, but in the end it was decided to instead build more Tu-22s and develop the Tu-160. The Bear G flew for the first time in the autumn of 1976, and it was cancelled in May 1977. The modified Tu-95 K-22 aircraft could carry 3 of the missiles, one recessed into the bomb bay and the other 2 under the wings. The tail gun station of these aircraft was deleted and replaced with an active ECM jammer. By this point, the remaining KM and non-Suffix Bears had been converted into Tu-95U and KU crew training aircraft. The trainers have a red stripe around the aft fuselage so you can identify them and stay well clear. Possibly the best known Bear variant is the Tu-95RT, or the Bear D, development of which began in March 1954. Bear D was developed to respond to yet another strategic problem that the Soviets faced as they contemplated a war with NATO, namely the ability of US and British carrier groups to approach the Soviet coastline and then launch conventional and nuclear strikes from unexpected angles. Unable to build a sufficiently powerful navy to take on the West at sea, the Soviet Navy began development of an anti-carrier capability based around long-range cruise missiles. These would be launched by nuclear and diesel-electric-powered submarines and fly to their targets at supersonic speeds. The Soviets referred to the first missile they developed as the P-6. In the West, it was the SSN-3 Shadok. It carried a 1,500-pound warhead on a nearly 12,000-pound missile that had a range of over 200 miles in ideal conditions. The issue with the P-6 was that the launching submarine had to fire it from the surface. The sub therefore had to be quite far from the carrier group. Given that the submarines were relatively slow, to get into a firing position meant that it needed to know where the carrier was and then get the missile in the right place to detect a target using its internal radar. The Bear D was developed to find the carrier groups and provide targeting information for the missiles while they were in flight. Achieving this meant a major redesign of the Bear, including removing the bomb bay doors and adding a large dielectric fairing over the space so that a large Uzbek surveillance radar could be added, and then replacing the nose radar with a data link system able to contact the submarines and transfer information to them. The first of these aircraft was converted from a Tu-95M, but problems with the electrical system delayed its first flight until May 1964. After extensive testing, including exercises in which it simulated long-range flights and tracking of surface targets, the Bear D was declared operational with the Soviet Navy on May 30, 1966. 53 examples were built, starting in 1963 and ending in 1969. The system was pretty complicated. On receiving missile launch orders, the submarine would ascend to periscope depth. It would then make contact with the commander of the Bear that had located the carrier group. Radar data from the Bear would be transmitted to the submarine, where the boat's captain would select a target. The missile control computer in the submarine would calculate the probability of kill based on the range and bearing, so that the commander could then choose what to do. Missiles were carried by the Whiskey and Juliet class diesel-electric submarines and the Echo class nuclear boats. Because of the long range of the mission, all of the RTs had in-flight refueling probes. Although their mission was pretty interesting, I'll cover the maritime tasked Bears another time in order to keep this video to a sensible length. Bear E was the Tu-95MR. This was another different mission type, and it was designed in response to a Politburo order for an ultra-long-range recon aircraft. It differed from the Tu-95M by way of a climate control pallet containing cameras installed in the bomb bay. Additional electronic reconnaissance aerials were installed in a dielectric fairing on the side of the fuselage just ahead of the tail. Inside the aircraft, a reconnaissance systems station was added. The MR was 8 feet longer than the regular Tu-95, and it weighed 400,000 pounds at maximum load. Service entry was in 1964 and 4 aircraft were constructed. One of them lacked the refueling probe for reasons unknown. During the 1970s, Bear production focused on the Tu-142 maritime patrol and anti-submarine variant. The bomber versions were used heavily in the period, and despite modifications, by the late 70s the fleet was aging and tired. But despite the service entry of the Tu-22 backfire and the slow development of the Tu-160, the Bear's combination of extreme range and carrying capacity remained useful to the strategic forces. So in 1978, development of a replacement strategic version of the aircraft commenced, based on the Tu-142. The Tu-95MS has a completely different cockpit behind a new dielectric fairing beneath the nose. A rotary launcher now occupies the bomb bay, and uprated Nk-12MP engines were fitted. Aircraft with just the rotary launcher were Tu-95MS-6s. There were also Tu-95MS-16 aircraft that could carry an additional set of 4 3-round ejector racks under the wings. After nuclear disarmament agreements with the US, the wing racks were removed from these aircraft. Kh-55 missiles were carried as the primary weapon. Known as the AS-15 Kent by NATO, it's a subsonic 3,600-pound missile that travels at low level to evade enemy defences in a similar manner to the Tomahawk. In the nuclear role, it carried a 200-kiloton thermonuclear warhead. Defensive armament was upgraded with twin-barreled GSH-23 cannons in the tail turret, like the backfire. That increased the number of barrels in that location to 4. Automation meant that the crew was reduced to 7. The commander, his deputy, 2 navigators, the engineer, systems operator, and the gunner. As a result of the extra kit and aerodynamic reasons, the MS is 161 feet long, 10 feet longer than the original. Maximum takeoff weight grew to 407,000 pounds, of which 192,000 pounds is now fuel. Tu-95MS flew for the first time in late 1979, and 84 of them would ultimately be built for the Soviet strategic forces. They are Bear H to NATO. The balance of these aircraft remain in Russian service today as the further upgraded Tu-95MA. In 1991, when communism fell, 147 Tu-95s remained in service with long-range aviation. These broke down as 84 Tu-95MSs, 63 K and K-22 aircraft, and 11 trainers. Numbers declined rapidly thereafter, as some older airframes were scrapped. Poor maintenance led to others being mothballed or stripped for parts. Somewhat ironically, some aircraft were in Ukraine when communism fell, and at the end of the 90s they were transferred back to the Russians. In 2025, Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb destroyed some of the remaining aircraft. Back at the start of its career, the Bear was part of the bomber gap crisis that caused the US to procure a fleet of over 700 B-52s. Comparing the two platforms is somewhat illustrative, as there really isn't anything else quite like the Bear, certainly not flying today. And, like the Bear, there were numerous versions of the Stratofortress. As a rule, they were about £100,000 heavier than the Tu-95 at full load, approaching £500,000 in some versions. They carried more fuel, over £300,000 of the stuff in some versions, and more weapons, £70,000 plays about £40,000. The Stratofortress is faster at 650 miles an hour, and it can fly higher at up to 50,000 feet. It's only in range that the Tu-95 equals the B-52. Both can cover about 10,000 miles on internal fuel. Like the B-52, the Bear was adapted in its early career to serve as a conventional bomber. Racks for up to 45 551-pound iron bombs can be fitted in the bomb bay. Despite not being quite as good as a Stratofortress, the Bear was still a threat to US cities and strategic infrastructure, and although ICBMs made it much less important to the Soviet war plan as the decades went by, it was still a regular visitor to the US coastline, and as the Bear D and the Tu-142, it was a regular shadow for carrier groups around the world. Intercepting Bears was one of the most exciting and the most photogenic fighter missions of the Cold War. Moving up close to the massive aircraft was an audio as well as a visual experience, given the colossal noise generated by the contra-rotating props. Even with recent losses, the durability of the Bear and its iconic status makes it an important part of Russian military aviation. Like the B-52, I imagine we'll be seeing them around for quite some decades yet. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and the brief deviation into targets for interceptors rather than interceptors themselves. Thanks for watching.